All right, let's get started. Today we have Banafsheh Rafiee, a PhD student here at RLA, and she's going to tell us about classical conditioning test beds for state construction.
Hi everyone. I'll be talking about classical conditioning testbeds for state construction. These testbeds are modeled after tasks in psychology, and the motivation is that we know animal can solve certain problems, and it would be interesting to see how well modern methods can solve the problems that animals can do. And the test beds are proposed to study online multi-step prediction, where we're interested in online performance. So first, let's see what we mean by state construction. In the reinforcement learning book, we assume that the state is provided by the environment, but that is a strong assumption. And we would like to consider a more general case where the environment only provides partial information or observations. And it's the job of the agent to construct the state from the stream of observations and actions. Here we have a diagram from the reinforcement learning book. It's the agent environment interaction loop, and the function that is responsible for constructing the state is this U function, which given the observations, action, and the state from the previous time step construct a new state. Then the state is used for multiple purposes, for coming up with a policy, for computing the value function, and for planning. So let's take a look at a simple example where state construction is needed. This is a partial observable environment where we have 4 states, top, right, bottom, left, and the actions are turning left and right, but there's only one binary observation signal. So the agent observes the same observation in 3 of the states, and it needs to construct the state itself from the stream of observations. For examples of state construction methods, we have recurrent neural networks, which use a recurrent mechanism to construct the state at this time step from the observations and from the state at the previous time steps. And it's kind of like they accumulate the information from time step 0 to now and summarize it in the state. Another example is predictive state representations, where we have predictions about the stream of observations and actions in the future. And if we have a sufficient number of predictions, then we can build an understanding of what state we are in. For example, for the simple problem, if I know that when I turn left, I see observation 1, I know that I'm in the state at the right. Or if I know that if I turn left twice, I see observations 0 and then 1, I know that I'm in state at the bottom. So now that we have some understanding of what we mean by state construction, let's come back to the test beds. Each test bed highlights a simple problem in state construction. The problems include how to predict a signal of interest when there is an empty gap between its occurrence and the signal that is predictive of it. This is analogous to trace conditioning in animal learning. Another problem is how to construct nonlinear combination of features that account for the interactions between them. And this is analogous to positive, negative patterning in animal learning. Let's take a look at an example of trace conditioning in animal learning called Eyeblink conditioning. In this example, the animal is exposed to a sound, and then after some time, a mild puff of air is presented, and the sound and puff of air are paired many times, and the animal associates the puff of air with the sound after many pairings, and produces a conditioned response of blinking before the puff of air happens. And here is some animal learning data from Kehoe 2014, and in the diagram on the left, we see an acquisition process where the animal learns the association between the puff of air and the sound. And at the y-axis, we have the conditioned response magnitude, and at the x-axis, we have the time since the sound was presented, and the bar shows when the mild puff of air was presented. And we can see that over trials, the animal builds a response to the sound. And on the diagram on the right, we have an extinction process where only the sound is presented and it's not followed by the puff of air. And so after multiple trials, the animal learns that the association is gone and its conditioned response goes to zero. So there are some modern deep reinforcement learning testbeds, such as DeepMind Lab, which include large-scale complex tasks for studying the state-of-the-art systems. And we think of the classical conditioning testbeds as a complement to these modern testbeds, in the sense that we want to study the same state-of-the-art learning systems, and failure on these problems suggests failure on more complex environments. We provide results characterizing a multitude of methods. We include modern methods as well as simpler ones inspired by models from animal learning. And we study the online performance of the testbeds, recognizing their strengths and weaknesses. The classical conditioning testbeds include a series of trials, on each of which a sequence of stimuli is presented. One kind of stimulus is unconditioned stimulus, or US, which is what we want to predict. It's like the puff of air in the Eyeblink example. Another type is conditioned stimulus, or CS, which provides some information about the US. And the time from the onset of the CS to the onset of the US is called the interstimulus interval, or ISI. And you can imagine that as ISI gets bigger, this problem becomes more challenging because there is a longer period of time from the US and the CS, which is predictive of the US. We want to predict the expected discounted value of the US, and we formalize this prediction task using general value functions, with cumulant being the US and a fixed gamma. In this example, gamma is 0.9, and you can see the ideal prediction. It's analogous to return in reinforcement learning. So let's look at the trace conditioning testbed. This testbed has one CS and one US. The challenge is that there is a period of time with no significant sensory events. And this period of time starts at the offset of CS and continues till the onset of the US. And it's called the trace interval. The trace conditioning testbed also includes 10 distractors happening in a Gaussian fashion.
Question?
Yep.
Could you go back a slide?
Yep.
Yeah. Could you explain why the ideal prediction looks the way it does?
So the ideal prediction is like analogous to return, where you can think of the US as a pseudo reward. And if you see, the US is on for 2 time steps. Yeah. The US is on for 2 time steps. So if you write the return, it will be like this. Is it clear? So we have the same return definition of the cumulant at time step t plus 1 plus gamma, the cumulant from time step t plus 2 plus gamma to the power of 2, and so on.
Yeah, I think what Rich means is also what the last is that shouldn't the ideal prediction start when you first see the CS? So at time step 219780, when you first start seeing the conditional stimulus like the sound or something, that is when you will start predicting something, right? So maybe the gamma should be adjusted such that this return decays to 0 at 219780.
So I see what you're saying, but so the thing is that the return has non-zero values even before the CS onset. So we can just say that the best thing that we can do is to predict after the CS onset, but the ideal prediction looks like this.
But actually, I think maybe the thing is that this is just depending on your choice of gamma. I think that's what Abhishek was maybe noting, is that, I mean, you could just ideally choose a much shorter gamma, and you would then see all of the, essentially the tail, the forward tail of the ideal prediction would just start to rise right after the CS. I mean, this is really just a knob you've tuned, right? And maybe that's what Rich is asking.
I see, but I think it's actually a good value of gamma, because like ISI in this example is 10, and then gamma is like 0.9. So it's like the horizon is 10 steps. So yeah.
Because I mean, the gamma would be the expected termination would be in 10 steps, but your tail will go on to 40 or 50 steps if you look at to where it gets to a non-trivial value. That's about, it'll get to be about 40 or 50, right? Which is, I think, what you're seeing. So.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, as I said, we have 10 distractors, and the first distractor happens more frequently, the second one is less frequent, and the last one is the least frequent. And the time from the onset of the US to the onset of the CS of the next trial is called inter-trial interval, or ITI, which is 100. So to see why this problem can be challenging, let's look at a failure example, which is TD with presence representation. Presence representation has one feature per stimulus, and also a bias feature. And here you can see the prediction of the presence representation in green. And you can see it's not a good prediction since it's quite different from the ideal prediction. And to see why that's happening, we can look at the feature vector. As I said, we have one bias feature, which is always on, and we have one feature per stimulus. So during CS activation, the feature corresponding to CS is 1, and during the US activation, the feature corresponding to US is 1. But for the trace interval, which is the one in the middle in red, there are no features active other than the bias feature, and so the presence representation does not represent the trace interval. And so that's why this is happening. The prediction that we have is the prediction only using the weight from the bias feature. We looked at a failure example. Let's look at a good prediction example, which is TD with tile-coded traces. Tile-coded traces keeps a trace of the onset of each stimulus and applies tile coding on them. Here you can see the trace of CS onset in blue. And so at CS onset, it has its maximum value, and then it goes down. And if you look at the prediction for tile coding traces, you can see that the prediction is quite good. It starts rising at the CS onset and keeps increasing as we approach the US, and then goes down. Now that we know what failure and success means for the trace conditioning testbed, we can look at some experimental results. Here I'm showing the results for two baseline methods. One is tile coding traces, and one is an RNN. The RNN uses truncated backpropagation through time to compute the gradient of the value function, and then applies TD. And to evaluate the performance, we use the squared return error, which is the difference between the return and the prediction squared, and then computed the mean within a trial and plotted the mean squared return error over trials. And the results are for different values of ISI, 5, 10, and 20. And we can see that the tile-coded traces method performed well across different values of ISI, whereas the RNN, its performance dependent on the value of ISI. Here I have the same experiment, but with 3 more baseline methods. One is the presence method, which I talked about before. One is presence onset offset, which has one feature per stimulus, but also one feature for the onset and one feature for the offset of each stimulus. And the other one is microstimuli, which is similar to tile coding traces, but instead of tile coding, it uses radial basis functions on the traces. And all parameters were optimized for area under the curve. Again, we see the trace-based methods, which is the tile coding traces one and the microstimuli, achieve a good performance across different values of ISI. We also studied the robustness of the baseline methods to their parameters for different values of ISI. And here, for the y-axis, we have the area under the curve of our performance measure, and for the x-axis, we have ISI. and each dot corresponds to one parameter setting of each method. And we see that as ISI gets bigger, the RNN becomes more sensitive to its parameters. We have two other test beds and results with all the same methods, but I'm not including those in the talk because there's not much time and I still need to finalize them. So we introduced classical conditioning test beds for studying online multi-step prediction. We learned from our experiments that RNNs can perform well when trained in an online fashion, but they become sensitive to their parameters as ISI gets bigger, and that the trace-based methods perform well across different values of ISI. It is still unclear how scalable the trace-based methods are to the number of signals and the ISI, and how much prior knowledge we need for using them. And thank you.
I have a question, if I can jump in. Nice stuff, Banafsheh. For the RNN, you showed as the ISI increased that the RNN was doing fine, and suddenly it was doing badly. So I guess my thought was, what's the truncation parameter you use for truncated backplot through time?
Let me. So can you see this?
Yes.
So in all cases, we tried all these parameters. For the RNN, I used truncation 5, 10, 20, and 40.
Okay, so big enough that it would span the ISI.
Yeah, I think like the point that I want to make is not that the RNN cannot solve the one with ISI 20, but that it becomes sensitive to its parameters. So maybe if I spend some more time trying many more truncation parameter, or I don't know, step sizes, it can like solve the problem, but it's just more sensitive to its parameters.
I believe that, yeah. I'm not surprised by that.
Banafsheh?
Yeah.
You've called this these test beds rather than like experiments. So could you explain why that is? So that these results are not meant to be the final results that anyone might do. Like other people could use these test beds and experiment with other methods. That's the idea, yes?
Yep. So you're asking why I'm calling them test beds other than problems?
Well, you did mention that you're offering these as a test bed that others might use.
Yep. Yeah.
So how if someone wanted to use them, how would they use them?
Yeah. So I think ideally I have like so each test bed is about a problem, but then there can be like variations of the same problem, and then someone can like test this method on all these different variations and like see how well it performs across all these variations, other than saying, okay, my method outperformed the other methods in just like one problem. I don't know if I answered your question.
I guess a part of the question would be that if this is something we could use, like is there a link on GitHub or something which we can look at?
A very good question, and not yet, but yeah, definitely I'm planning to do that. yes, because the point of this whole project is that people can use these test beds and like try their ideas. Yeah.
Banafsheh, I have a question for you. So I've also been kitting up similar kinds of trace conditioning things, as I think you know. And one thing that I was wrestling with, and I'm hoping you've wrestled with and have a great answer for, is how we should think about building in non-stationarity and stochasticity into the test beds. So, for instance, stochasticity in the interval or subtle drift in the intervals. Have you played with that? Do you have good observations about that? Like, what are good parameters of test beds of this kind? I'd be excited if you had insight there.
So I started with keeping everything simple. So if you notice, the only source of like randomness are the distractors. But I agree. So I'm thinking we could have variations of the same problem where the problem is the trace conditioning thing, but we could vary multiple things, maybe vary the ISI, like in some of the intervals it's 9, in some of the intervals it's 10, and yeah, but I haven't done any experiments on that yet.
Okay. It's kind of cool, like the predictions that will start to smush and things. I mean, there's all sorts of neat effects when you start to do things like see drift, and you don't have any kind of representational element that allows the system to track that drift. Like if it's just trying to essentially live in a non-stationary world. Anyway, it's super cool. We should chat sometime. I'd love to talk more with you about it because there are some weird things, and I think maybe you have great insight into it.
Thanks.
I have a really basic question, and first of all, I wanted to say I really like that you're coming up with these sort of very simple benchmark tasks, because I feel like that's something that's really important for research. But going back to Rich's question, so it seems like your idea of the correct prediction or the ideal prediction is this gamma discounted sum of the signal, and that kind of makes sense for reward because that's usually what you want to maximize. But when you have a signal like this, that's like a sharp spike. Like why, like normally when an animal, you can imagine an animal is predicting something like this, the prediction probably looks like something is going to happen in 2 seconds, right? So why did you choose the gamma discounted sum rather than the actual time at which something is going to happen as a prediction?
So it's kind of like why because it's I'm not predicting the exact time of the US happening. I'm kind of predicting like the probability of its happening. And you're saying why not predicting the time itself?
Yeah. So like for example, let's say the signal always happens exactly 5 seconds after the first stimulus. Then the probability is not slowly rising, right? Like the probability is 0 until 5 seconds, and then it rises to 1, right? There's no uncertainty there. So
yeah. Yeah, I think that's a hard question, but I kind of feel maybe it's more useful this kind of prediction where you're not predicting the exact time that something is happening, but like the probability of it's happening. Like so maybe it's more useful. But
I have maybe one thought. I mean,
I have thoughts too, Martha.
I mean, you mentioned in the beginning that you wanted to mimic psychology problems, and in some sense, the thing that you want your agent to predict is part of the problem in this case because it's the test bed. So maybe you're saying that you want to see if our learning algorithms can make these types of predictions rather than the what happens in exactly 5 steps kind of predictions.
Yeah, thank you.
Because it's based on psychology and biologically plausible settings or something.
this is awesome. I think Martha's bang on. And one cool thing, like we can imagine making value function formulations where it's a countdown timer. We do this all the time. You have a cumulative 1, and you keep how many steps until I reach the future event. So you can look at things ramping down in a linear way, ramping up in a linear way, exponentials. I think the motivation maybe, Banafsheh, for yours from the biological arena is in fact things like ramping cells in the brain, where there are known populations of neurons in all sorts of deep brain structures that start to increase in what looks like a semi-exponential, maybe not a pure exponential, but at least in a sort of an upward curving way, the same way that our usual fixed gamma formulation behaves. And so the evidence seems to suggest that those populations are at various different timescales, that some ramp really quickly, some ramp really slowly, some ramp up and some ramp down. So what you're presenting is what could be thought of as one of those populations. And so then the choice of the gamma that you have could be very well grounded in any number of biological timescales, and that seems like a very compelling first thing to do. So I think it does make quite a bit of sense, despite the other relations.
I just want to make one more thing, and I'll stop. I swear. Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing. Like it seems like the objective in this case could be either to mimic the mechanisms we see in biology, or there could be like the underlying objective, right? So I'm trying to sort of disentangle this question of, do we want to make artificial systems that are trying to copy the mechanisms we see biological systems doing, or do we have like an actual underlying problem and the biological system is sort of approaching that and has its own approximation errors, if you will. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of like the second approach that you said. That not that we want to have something that exactly models what the animals do, but maybe more like ideas or inspirations for what an intelligent behavior should look like. So yeah.
Thanks.
So this might be a little bit more on the answer side. So I like all the setup and Pavlovian conditioning, as you know. When you're comparing the trace-based methods with the RNN, it seems that the trace-based methods, you're defining what the recurrent structure is, right? It's a trace. It's a trace of all the signals. Whereas for the RNN, it's needing to discover that, right? So if I was trying to figure out what would be a fair comparison, it might be to include a non-recurrent neural net on top of the traces as well. So right now you're using the tiles on top of the eligibility traces. And this is a small difference in, let's say, the rich style diagram where the recurrence is going directly in, right? The same representation is used for the value function as is fed into the next time step. And this trace-based architecture is saying, oh, I'm going to do one thing on the recurrence, which is sort of analog, right? And I'm going to do another thing with the representation, right? The thing that's fed to the value function. And so I guess my question is, have you thought about how you'd like to sort of push the representation part of this further?
So could you say again how we could make this comparison fair?
Well, it's just a different comparison. So the RNN gets less information than the trace-based tile coder, right? So right now you've designed the trace lengths and you've designed the tile coder. And if we were to make the problem much, much larger, it would become ill-suited to it, right? So if you chose an intertrial interval or an interstimulus interval of thousands or millions, the current parameters would not be a good fit. Right?
Yeah.
And so there's the question of, well, what falls in between the space of trace-based tile coders and full RNNs? Right? And so you could imagine having a simple MLP on top of the traces, and that's to sort of counteract the tile coder. Then you could also imagine doing maybe other things. So I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have an answer for what method we can have that is both kind of scalable, and in the sense that it learns this temporal relationship itself, and is performing well. But I think, yeah, I should think about that. It's a very good question. Thanks.
I'm just going to add in here that we've actually tried this thing where we've used traces. Here, I think the traces with Talconi is kind of a baseline anyway, and then RNN is sort of the more advanced thing that you're seeing if it does, like how well it works. So, but we have actually tried to give traces to an MLP, or like just a standard neural network, and that does seem to work pretty well in some problems. And actually, there's an iClear paper recently this year from Katja Hoffman where they did just that, and they found really good performance on some more interesting domains. I think in the what's that domain setting she has? A more interesting domain anyway than the ones we've been looking at. But now you could imagine another thing we're kind of looking at too is putting in traces, but also the most recent observation and still using recurrence.
Mm-hmm.
Because one thing you lose with traces is precision. So it's sort of a weak form of memory, I think, but it does give you some usefulness. But I don't think traces on their own are the answer added to a neural network.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Is there a causal relationship between the timing of the CS and the shape of the return? Or does it not have to do with where CS is?
By shape of the return, you mean like okay.
Does the return start ramping up? Is it meant to is it meant to be causing?
No, because like the return of the US doesn't depend on the CS, and like the ISI is at the time from the CS to the US. So now there's another relationship between the two.
Sorry, it's a really basic question, but I'm just trying to understand if the return is meant to rise before the CS happens. Is that on purpose, or is that something we want to avoid?
I think that's something that so we want to predict when the US is going to happen, and the CS is providing some information about it, but the return of the US doesn't depend on the CS. So that's why the ISI doesn't have an effect on the shape of the return.
But then doesn't that make the problem much harder in the sense that if you, so like I'm just moving around in this world, stuff hasn't happened for a long time, and now I need some indication from the world to tell me that, hey, something might happen soon, right? So how will I start predicting something if I have like no indication from the world? So I think here the CS is the proxy for, like a simple proxy for, hey, something is going to happen, like, so now if you're saying that the prediction that you have to make is not conditioned on that, how would it work?
I see what you're saying, but so the way that I think about it is that we do not. So there is this achievable performance, which is from the time of the CS onset, and maybe when evaluating our algorithms, we can have like the achievable performance and then see if our methods get close to that instead of to the ideal prediction, error of 0. So yeah, I think it's fair to evaluate the algorithm based on the achievable performance.
Right. Yeah. So maybe we can change the definition of what is ideal in that case. I don't know. Yeah, just saying.
I kind of like the ideal achievable thing, but maybe like people think differently about it.
In terms of a model, would you consider like a 1D convolution or like a WaveNet type model instead of an RNN? as for an efficient deep network?
But I kind of want the recurrent mechanism for this problem. So I think the RNN is like the best representative, but maybe more complicated models of RNNs like LSTMs, GRUs. Yeah.
Robin, your point, I think your point's pretty neat in that when we think of like transformers and other things, you almost have this window of the past that's all feeding into the present. And so in that way, I mean, much like unrolling an LSTM, you actually do have some kind of a historical trace, but maybe it's more akin to like, hey, just what's feeding in from our replay buffer as opposed to like explicitly creating a trace. But there is a neat analogy there. So those models, there's something there that's quite interesting. I'm just not sure what it is yet. Maybe Banafsheh actually has got her finger on already, though.
Double asked about ISI and whether it's fixed or learned, and yeah, it's fixed. So it's part of the problem.
So is the idea the agent only gets the observation for that moment, and it has no memory of the past aside from what's in the RNN state that carries forward? Is that what's happening?
So could you say again? What was the question?
How much information the agent can carry through time to the next step? Is it just the RNN state that it can carry to the next step?
Yeah, but yeah, so the information is in the state, but so to train the RNN, we need to do back propagation through time. So we kind of need to go all the way back. For efficiency, we use truncated back propagation through time. So we only go back a number of steps. But we do need to store all these data in the buffer for the length of the truncation parameter.
So if you had that buffer, then you could use a CNN on that buffer, or that you could use a one deconvolution on that buffer if you're maintaining that buffer. I just think it'd be so much more efficient than RNN. But you'd have to have the buffer in the nice format already like maintained, but then it would be a trivial thing for one deconvolution. And it would be always right if you didn't have any stochasticity. Like RNNs are going to be really sensitive to how long the window is, and they seem to break down the longer the time is. And a CNN, if you just give it more space, it'll just learn it. It doesn't really take more space, but it would be a decaying performance. I don't think in the same way.
So let me just say, that sounds like a great idea, Robin. And I think Banafshe's point is in developing this testbed is not that she's done the ideal or the fanciest way you could do a recursive neural network. It's more like a baseline. Here's a recursive neural network that's doing pretty good, and she's offering the testbeds for people like you to think of better methods. That would be great.
It's cool. Thank you, Rich. And thanks for the awesome talk.
All right, if there are no more questions, let's all thank Banafsheh for the cool talk.
Thank you.